Hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from Vancouver, Canada, to everybody who are joining today's session. So, my name is Sina, and I'm community admin of Microsoft Fabric Cafe. So, I'm super, super excited to be here again with you guys to learn and grow together. So I'm pretty sure today's session is going to be another amazing session and with another actually guest speaker. So I'm not gonna waste any time. I'm just gonna jump straight into the slide to see what we have today. There we go. So today actually our September 28th, 2024, 8 a.m. Pacific time. As you guys know, every Saturday, 8 a.m. Pacific time, we have amazing session with different guest speakers. So today is the 10th Fabric Coffee session at Microsoft Fabric Cafe. So, and this is our today's agenda. So we have introduction and Microsoft Learn AI Skills Challenge, which is started. And our today's guest speaker is going to be Jared, and he's going to be with us shortly. And of course, if you guys have any questions during the session, just put it in the chat box and will be answered definitely by Jared. And about the riddle, so as you guys know, we have riddle at the end of the sessions, and let's see who's gonna be our today's winner. So just guys be aware that as you guys know, those answer just on the StreamYard will be acceptable, nowhere else like LinkedIn or YouTube. Just make sure you guys switch to, if you are joining from YouTube or LinkedIn, just switch to StreamYard if you want to participate in the riddle. Uh, yeah, and let's move on. So this is an introduction to Microsoft Learn community. So as everybody knows, a tech community to stay updated with the latest news. And if you guys wanna uh, join, there is a link over there, aka.ms/learning rooms, and you guys can join the room and choose your room based on your interest, specific language, and whatever which is fit to you. And of course, one of those rooms is your room, Microsoft Fabric Cafe, which is a Microsoft Learn community, and we actually concentrated on Microsoft Fabric and provide learning and support to Fabric users all levels, and a forum for everyone to learn, share, and grow skill together. And of course, in our cafe, learning meets fun. So as you can see, these are our links for our social platform, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Microsoft Learning Room. Just make sure join those links to actually uh, grow and scale together. Uh, and of course, there's a code of conduct to keep our community positive. And thank you guys for being part of our community, to be actually respectful, having collaboration, and stay professional, and actually stay on topic and avoid spam. And if there is any actually uh, issue, just report them. So, as you guys know, so we have AI skill challenges, which is introduced by Microsoft Learn, which is started already from September 24th until November 1st. If you guys want to register, you can go for it and register for them. And we as a Microsoft Fabric Cafe, we have a session during this period of time, and after completing the challenges, you will earn a digital badge, of course. So, and in this period of time, We have a few amazing sessions, which we are done with one of those with James, which was last week. If you guys want to rewatch those, it is available on our social platform, which is highly recommended. And today we have Jared, another amazing guest speaker. And if you guys want to join the upcoming sessions, so all of those actually registration link are announced on our social platform, and you guys can register right away. And for today session, we have Jared. Let me just join Jared to the stage. Uh, Hello, Jared. How's it going?
Morning, Cinna. Doing well. How are you?
Good. Thanks for your energy. Yeah, nice. So
If
I
you
know
get
that.
nothing else this morning, we should get lots of energy because we're
Oh,
talking about fabric. Super exciting topic, right?
oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. Thank you for joining today's session, for being here. Of course, we're gonna learn lots of things. So I'm not gonna waste any time. Just gonna hand it over to you. Let me just share your screen and hand it over. There we go. Everything is perfect.
Alrighty. We'll
Oh
kick it
yeah,
off then.
yeah. Let's get started. Yeah. Okay.
Alrighty.
Yeah, I'm just gonna be in the back of it just before leaving, guys. If you have any questions, just put it in the comments, and will be answered. I think topic by topic, because Jared is gonna pause after each topic to answer all the question related to the topic, and then move on to the next actually topic. So I'm gonna be in the back of stage. So the stage is yours. There we go. Thank you.
Alrighty. Try not to disappoint then. So, good
Oh,
morning, Microsoft Fabric Cafe, or as Cinna said, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever your time zone is currently. Great to have you here, and it's my honor and my privilege to share some information with you today about lessons I've learned from this product over the first year of implementing it after it being generally available. A little bit about myself. My name is Jared Kuehn. I'm a senior data engineer for a company called Heartland Business Systems. We're a consulting firm based out of the Midwest United States. Do a fair amount in the physical infrastructure space, servers, networking, cabling, but we also have a pretty significantly sized Microsoft practice focused on anything from custom dev, web development, CRMs, ERPs, and my specialty, which is data and artificial intelligence. Been working in the data industry for well over 10 years now. Most of that has been in consulting, and most of that has been with Microsoft products. Probably evident from the certifications I have on screen, including the Fabric Cert, which I just got earlier this year. And I also have certifications on on-prem solutions as well. Okay, that's all, at least the boring stuff you need to know about me. More importantly, here's what you do need to know about me. First of all, Weird Al, my dear friend over here, is my hero. If you're not familiar with him, he's a popular artist here in the United States. And one of the things I value is not only that he keeps things lighthearted and entertaining, but he's a great storyteller. And that's the way that we've always shared information with each other, really from the dawn of time. So that's my goal today. So we're going to talk about Fabric, but more importantly, I'm going to tell you a story about Fabric that helps tell the story of how things have progressed this first year and where I think it's going to go from here. So with that, a quick agenda. We're going to walk through Fabric. Now, I'll give a quick note right now. I'm not going to touch on every capability of Fabric because we'd probably be here for 3 or 4 hours. I'm going to focus at least on some areas that I've worked in fairly extensively, and I expect to be areas that people want to work with Fabric in a lot of situations. We're going to cover that, and I'm going to introduce a rating system. We'll get to that in a moment. But we'll talk about all of these capabilities, and then let's talk about having some hope for the future. A product's in year one, it's going to keep evolving. What do we want to see out of the product? Q&A, as Cinna mentioned, we'll get into that as we go section by section, and I'll try and answer those questions as best as I can. And of course, those riddles, got a couple interesting ones for you at the end, so stay tuned. with that, let's jump into it today. And the first thing, I want to at least talk a little bit about today's format. In case you didn't notice, I like keeping things energetic, I like keeping things fun, but also educational. So, first thing is the things I'm going to talk about today. It'll be a little bit about technical capabilities. It'll also be a little bit about design principles. How should we really consider using the product? And to be fair, there's a whole lot of different design principles out there. Some people like working with structured data, others like working with unstructured. The variations out there are going to be significant. So, a lot of what I'll talk to you about today is going to be based on the research and experience I've had with the product this year, but it'll also be based on some design principles that I typically advocate for. And that's an area we may agree to disagree based on different viewpoints. So, if you have a different viewpoint and it's based on different design principles, I'm all good for that. But I'll at least share my story from the lens that I have here. Now, again, I mentioned the rating system, and this is where I want to have fun with this because I don't want this to just turn into a smash and bash. Oh my gosh, there are so many issues with the product, and that's all that we see. Because that doesn't really tell the full story, right? So we're going to try and create a rating system, which is clearly scientific and is not based on any sort of bias or anything whatsoever. You'll see in a moment. I have a 3-position rating system for today's talk, and we're going to do it feature by feature. First rating a feature in Fabric can get is tag. TAG, things are great. What I mean by that is the solution feature, it works pretty well. There's not a whole lot to have concerns or complaints about. It's pretty stable, maybe not 100% perfect, but where it's not great, it's probably going to grow quickly and it will continue to be a foundation of working in Fabric. If we take a step down there in quality, RFI is going to be our next one. Room for improvement. Product's only been out year 1, so any of this really could be room for improvement. But this really tells us that the base solution works pretty well, but depending on your situation, it may not work exactly as you might hope. And so there's certain gotchas that you might run into, and I'm going to try and call those out as we go along so that not only will you get my opinion of things, but also you get certain tidbits of how to work best with some of these features. And then finally, kind of something that I do a little bit on my YouTube channel is BTH, bad things happen. We work with technology. We assume there's always a possibility things don't quite go the way we'd hoped to, that we expected to. Any good product is still going to do that. But it's still important to call that out that bad things do happen, and that can happen in some of these features. All right, so that at least sets the stage. We're going to take a look at some of these features. We're going to give it a rating system. Again, that's going to be fairly opinion-based, but if you disagree with me, I'd love to hear about that in the comments. So let's start our story. And like any good story, it starts at the very beginning, and the beginning here starts with licensing. In order to get into the product, you have to figure out what your licensing looks like. So what does it look like as far as understanding our licensing in Fabric and how well that's understood in the community? I hate to say it, but I'm starting off with a BTH rating here on understanding licensing. What I found so far in this first year is in talking with a number of organizations, there's a lot of excitement about Fabric. People are very curious about it, all the capabilities it has. There's so much to talk about. But the consistent question I get back regularly is, so how does licensing work? Because it doesn't make sense to me. So here I'm going to quick call out. Here are the 2 common questions that I've heard on Fabric licensing. We're going to address it here to make sure everybody understands. First thing that comes up pretty commonly is, how does Power BI licensing fit into my Fabric solution? Well, point you to the box in the bottom of this graphic. SKUs that are smaller than F64 require a Pro or Premium per user license or a Power BI individual trial to consume Power BI content. What this means is if you're getting into a Fabric implementation, Power BI licensing is going to be part of your cost. You have to take that into consideration. What it's calling out there is where you get to a certain SKU, in this case an F64 or higher, your viewers of content, those who aren't building, they're just looking at content, will find that you get to F64 and higher, you don't need to pay for their licensing anymore. That gets baked in to your capacity. Your developers, though, still will need that. Some listening to this might be sitting here saying, well, this is pretty easy to understand because it follows Power BI premium capacity licensing. And you're right, it does. But I think what this has shown based on the conversations this year is some orgs have worked in that model. And so this is going to be clearly understood. But a decent part of the world hasn't worked with that yet. And so a little bit of this is foreign concept. So first thing is, when you're planning out your Fabric implementation, make sure you plan out what your Power BI licensing needs to be. Second big thing that comes up for licensing is that the Fabric capacity itself is an Azure resource. I can't tell you the number of times this past year somebody's asked me for a quote on Fabric, and I've given them an Azure pricing calculator, and they're like, why are you giving me this? I want to know what the Fabric license cost is. Well, it's not a license cost. It's an Azure resource that you provision. And again, similar to Power BI premium capacity, but that's something that I think gets a little confusing because you've got part of your licensing needs to be Power BI, which gets provisioned within your licensing within your tenant. And then the other part is resource. So make sure, at least, again, you plan for both sides and make sure that that's a talking point for people, that they understand they don't get the cost by just provisioning a license. They get the cost by provisioning the capacity. And then, like any resource in Azure, or at least most resources in Azure, you can play around with them. You can pause them and unpause them, and that impacts cost. So, two most common questions I get on that, want to cover that here. Let's see. Check in on questions and so far. Love Weird Al and White and Nerdy. Yes. You, Jeffrey, you and I are in the same boat. One of my favorite songs. Aziz has a question. I'm hearing that any FSKU comes with a certain storage free, but I cannot find any documentation to support that. So, and I'll say that's at least another part. I'll talk at least about one aspect of that in a little bit here. There is some storage consideration associated to it. I'll say for the most part, the cost for the storage is fairly light. So I wouldn't worry about that as much when you're trying to get into Fabric. The bigger thing, which I'll touch on a little bit here, is some capacities, well, actually all capacities, will have a limitation as far as size of certain things. And I'll leave it at that, and I'll talk about that when we get to that topic later. Good questions. So you get your licensing worked out. You figured out that plan. Now the next part is, all right, I've got my licensing. I want to get this environment up and running. What's my rating for getting an environment up and running in Fabric? Here, this is a pretty easy tag for me. I love how easy it is to get Fabric up and running because it's really just two steps. You provision that capacity, that Azure resource, and get your administrators established. But beyond that, there's not a whole lot you have to set up for initial settings. And then you apply to workspaces. Whatever workspaces you apply it to, get to use Fabric capabilities, and you're off and running. It's that simple. This isn't just an infomercial. It actually works that way. And honestly, that's one of the biggest selling points for Fabric, is compared to doing comparable things in other solutions where I might have to piecemeal data factory with some sort of data storage, with which, if it doesn't have a SQL environment, maybe I have to bring in Databricks for compute, depending on my use case. This is the big game changer for Fabric. and I'd say it's working as designed. But like any good product, you have to consider, how do I want to get started? And so there's a couple things I want to make sure I advise people about. And this isn't necessarily about the product, it's just advice about how you should approach it. So the first thing I'd say, beware information overload. You get that license provision or that capacity provisioned, you hit that new item button, and then you start scrolling through, and seriously, it looks like that Star Wars opening where like you're trying to scroll through and just see all the possibilities of what you can do, and it reads like a Star Wars scroll. Da, 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 da. You can store data. Da, 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 da. You can prepare data. Da, 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 da. And you can analyze and train data, and it just keeps going. And as you go further, like a good scroll there, the top options disappear. There's so much that you can do, but do I do everything all at once? And that's where I would suggest, no, don't necessarily jump in all at once, because we know what happens if we go in too many directions all at once. You get into some situations where some of the directions you go, they work out great, other ones just fall flat, and it's because you don't invest time effectively in all of them. So what I would advocate for is, if you're looking to get started with Fabric, pick 2 features you're going to go for and just stick with that as a base. If all you do today is a traditional relational warehouse and something like SSIS or Azure Data Factory to process data, that's all you have to do. You can knock a good Fabric implementation out of the park with just that, and you'll get your value for your money. And then once you've got that solid foundation, then go out, then go in and take a look at those other capabilities, which will be there waiting for you. Make sure you get that strong foundation. That's a good spot to start with any good implementation. Second thing I'll call out here too, and this gets a little bit to Aziz's question earlier, capacity considerations. So when Microsoft talks about it, it's like, all right, I get 2 capacity units or 4 capacity units. What exactly does that mean? I'll say for the most part, this is still the part that's a little bit hard to understand. Here's a couple of areas that I would especially focus on as you continue planning out your SKU capacity. First of all, your Spark cluster. So in case you haven't worked with Apache Spark in Fabric yet, you go into your workspace settings and you get a view like this, which showcases how you can configure your Spark pools per workspace. Right here, I've got pretty much the default starter pool. Why I'm bringing this up as far as a consideration is, in the F2 SKU, if you go with just the default starter workspace or a starter pool, you can start up 1 Apache Spark session, and that's it. You hit your limit right there, which means if you want to have multiple people working with different Spark clusters, because right now they can't share Spark clusters, you either have to increase your SKU or you have to change the starter pool to reduce the number of nodes per pool. Not exactly the greatest place to start when you're jumping into an implementation. So I would at least take a look at that and see, how much do you expect Apache Spark to be in your implementation, and plan accordingly. The other part here is semantic model storage. I'll say this is something I actually just ran into this week. What this looks like, if if you don't plan for it appropriately like I did, you end up going with a small SKU. You're trying to deploy a new Power BI report out to the service in one of your Fabric workspaces, and you get this very cryptic 500 internal server error. What does that mean? Had a couple of conversations with Microsoft, and essentially what they've told me is that if you've worked with Power BI premium SKUs, the different SKUs have capacity limitations for semantic model storage. For an F2 SKU, that's a basic, I think, 3 gigabytes is your limit there. So if you hit that, you can no longer push Power BI reports. The same thing applies to Fabric SKUs. they're going to have the same sort of limitations. So again, if you plan on using a lot of Power BI semantic models and you might have a decent amount of data storage in there, think about how large that storage is going to be, because that will impact what size of SKU you will need to implement those semantic models within Fabric. All right, that's enough about at least initial. Oh wait, one last thing I'll say about environment setup, and I intentionally broke this off into a separate consideration for environment setup because I give it a completely different recommendation as far as my rating system. What does regions look like in Power BI? Might confuse you, but let me explain. Region setup in Fabric, I give this a pretty hard BTH. Bad things happen here. Why do I talk about that as far as the region setup? Let me explain. As before you get into your Fabric implementation, check your Power BI tenant region. Where you can find this is when you're looking at the UI, there's that question mark in the upper, well, at least for you, upper right corner of the screen, and you can get into the About Power BI section, which gives you a graphic like I have in the lower left-hand corner here. Important to note is that red box I have there, where at least for me, my data is stored in North Central US. This means two things. One, when I provision my Fabric capacity, I have to provision it in the same region that my Power BI tenant is stored in. Reason I bring this up is if you don't do that, you'll be able to create the Fabric capacity. You'll even be able to apply it to your workspaces. And then you'll go and you hit the new item button to try and create something new in Fabric. And you'll get a message that says your trial has expired and you need to set up capacity. And you're like, I just did this. Why do I need to do it again? Most likely it's because it's in the wrong region. So if you're having troubles implementing this, double check that. Other big call out here, and this is the bigger issue I've had, is the graphic on the right here, which is part of this article in Microsoft Learn, Reliability in Microsoft Fabric. I think this has gotten improved since when I initially set up my first Fabric environment. But when I set up my first Fabric environment, I was able to provision the workspace with a Fabric capacity in the appropriate region. And I actually still had limitations of things that I could do. This one I haven't gotten a really good answer on, but what I've come to understand is essentially not all regions support all features of Fabric yet. Where that stands today, I just grabbed this graphic the other day, so I'm assuming this is up to date. But at least beyond this viewpoint, I haven't seen anything else. And when I've asked Microsoft about this, this is the graphic they typically point me toward to understand this. So think about this before you get too deep into your Fabric implementation, because the last thing you want to do is say, I'm going to go and start with a brand new feature, and then find you can't do it in your environment. So that's why at least there, I give it a BTH more so because I think this is really hard to understand for people getting into Fabric. And it's just not very intuitive when we think about it being a SaaS offering. All right, enough about environment setup. Let's pause for questions. Let's see. Lucas says, hey, Jared, love your energy. Just a brief question. You'll talk a little bit about initial governance actions and setups to implementation. Governance, I'll talk a little bit about that. Granted, that would be really complicated to talk about given all the things that Fabric can do, but I will try and address that when appropriate. And Jeffrey has a question. What will be the top 2 areas to start with? Oh, that's a good question. So again, Jeffrey, when you talk about what would be the top 2 areas, think about what are the areas that are the foundation of your analytical environment. Because I would expect most people who are looking to implement Fabric, they're looking for a one-stop shop where they do everything. So I would plan for the things that are going to be foundational for you. So pick your preferred form of data movement, be it pipelines, notebooks, maybe data flows, shortcuts. We'll talk about all of those things in a couple minutes here. Plan your data movement strategy and then plan at least one form of data storage. If you're just dealing with like a base bronze layered or medallion architecture, Lakehouse will do perfectly fine for you. You don't have to overcomplicate the situation. If all your data is relational and you just want to go straight into that warehouse build, use a warehouse. I would say at least stick to those areas. One form of data movement, one form of data storage, and just stick with that. Make sure at least you've got a solid foundation there, because especially most of where you will go is from getting data into your environment and having it stored there that you can start playing with it. As far as which ones I'd specifically pick might depend on, again, your particular data structures. Let's see. Other questions we got. David Mills talks about choosing the right capacity can be tricky. I got hit by a throttling issue on one occasion due to a fabric pipeline churning through the CUs. Any tips on hitting the sweet spot on getting the right capacity? I've run into that situation too. Monitoring comes up in a little bit later here. I'll answer that question when I talk about monitoring, because there's at least one way that I've been looking at it when I've been looking to provision my SKUs. At least from the options I've seen out there, it's the best that I found. Don Juan asks, what are the architectural considerations when setting up workspaces initially? Do I cover that here? No, actually I don't. So let me go ahead and answer that right now. Architectural considerations for workspaces. Here's at least two general recommendations I'd have is assuming that like workspaces, you might work in a dev environment, test environment, production environment. I'd plan on having at least multiple capacities in your strategy. There's a couple of gotchas that can happen that David talked about as far as the throttling that can happen. And it doesn't hurt to have a capacity on hand that you can use when you potentially hit that throttling. Beyond that, there are some other considerations around number of developers that you'd have. And so, like, if you're working with multiple developers in your environment and you've got multiple stages of deployment, you might want to consider having your developers having their individual workspaces tied to a capacity. I'll explain that a little bit more. But to directly answer your question, Don Juan, I've seen some people successfully implement a single capacity across 10, 15 workspaces and they work fine. I've seen others where having a capacity spread across so many workspaces, there's so much contention for especially things like Apache Spark clusters that there's just becomes a lot of infighting. So I'd say at least for setting up your workspaces, set up at least enough that you have a good dev test production environment. Plan to have different capacities for each. And then from there, think about which features you're going to use. Spark, I'd say, is the big one of the more you expect to use Spark, the more you're going to want to consider having either a larger SKU available for people who are using Spark, or maybe giving people individual like F2 SKUs, and then they have their own single source of compute to do what they need to do. All right, that catches up on questions. I was going to ask Sina, I don't know if there's a good way to, like, as I'm answering these questions, to bring them up on the screen. I haven't worked with that here, so I'm not quite sure how that part works.
Yeah, for sure, you can do that. If you hover your mouse on this one, so you can see, for example, from David, you can see. You see that?
Okay, what exactly did you click on for that? Was that...
Click on it. That's it. Maybe you're not allowed to do that.
Oh, man. Unfortunately, these are really good questions, and I'm narrating them, but I'm like to show on the screen.
Sorry about that.
All right, that's okay. That's okay. We'll make
But
that
I
work.
got you. I can do it whatever you want. So when you're going through the questions, I can just show it. Like,
Okay.
yeah, perfect.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
No worries.
All right, that gets us caught up on questions. Let's move on. All right. So you get your environment set up. Now, next step is like people are asking about provisioning for getting data into your environment, storage. So let's talk about getting data into your environment. We've seen a lot of the sales pitches and demonstrations about Fabric. You've probably seen two common ways to get data into the environment: shortcuts, mirroring, kind of been a big talking point. So, where do they rate up on my rating system? Let's start with shortcuts. Shortcuts, I give a pretty strong tag. I think things are great when it comes to shortcuts because I think it works exactly as Microsoft says it works. You copy data quickly, and again, copying is sort of in quotes because they don't really copy data, but it looks like they copy data. But at least important way, it's a really easy way to get the data into your environment. And especially the fact that it works with things like Azure Data Lake Storage and especially Dataverse. The fact that it works with Dataverse has saved me significant time on certain projects because if you've ever had to pull data out of Dataverse into like some relational structure, it's not easy. Like I haven't really found a good approach for it yet, but at least the approaches I've used, it's functional, but it could be so much better. Dataverse integration, oh, when I saw this and I implemented it for the first time, like my jaw dropped to the floor because it was so simple and it's worked so well. One gotcha I've got here that makes it a little bit of risk for room for improvement, but I keep it as a tag because I think it's pretty easy to work around. Monitor your source environment if you implement a shortcut. The shortcutting in between workspaces in Fabric works really well, and I haven't seen a lot of concerns about resource contention and whatnot. However, if you use that to connect to something like Dataverse, you want to make sure you know what your Dataverse data transactions look like. I'll say at least one example I ran into was where a user would interact with the UI. It would create a transaction in Dataverse. That record hitting Dataverse would then trigger a bunch of background processes that would perform additional functions on the data. Shortcuts are essentially implementing change data capture. So each of those events is triggering, okay, I see this. Now I need to make sure that state of the record is available in Fabric. And the one risk here is you actually end up causing negative performance issues. Not all that uncommon to CDC, but you need to think about it that way. So make sure at least you monitor your source environment. So that's at least for shortcuts for certain situations. The other one's mirroring. Let's see what mirroring looks like. Mirroring, I give it a notch down and I go to room for improvement. When I heard about Fabric first and mirroring initially, I was super excited about it at some of the conferences. They talked about it at Ignite last year, and when I went to FabCon this year, it just seems so promising. Take those relational data structures, get them into Fabric like a shortcut, and there we go. We work with it. Well, basic scenarios, what I found is that it works great, but there's a number of limitations. So, known limitations that I want to make sure people understand is two big ones that, again, think about this before you go all in on mirroring. First one's networking. If you haven't run into this yet, or if you haven't tried mirroring, you want to make sure for your source that your networking is flexible enough to allow Fabric in. I'll take Azure SQL Database for an example. In order to do mirroring from an Azure SQL database, I have to do it via the SQL database's public endpoint. I can't do it yet via the private endpoint. So if you're working in this solution and you don't want to open up the public endpoint, mirroring isn't an option for you. You have to consider another approach to get data out of that environment. The other big limitation is that size does matter. And actually, it was very interesting because I just saw a guy in a cube post a video on this exact same topic. Take a look at this screenshot here. This is me attempting to mirror an Azure SQL database that I think I have set up as an S0. Something like that, even if the networking works, I still can't mirror it unless if you're going with the DTU structure or the DTU licensing model, your SKU has to be a particular size. 100 DTUs are larger. If you can't do that, mirroring isn't an option. Taking a look at the documentation, though, it does look like if you go with the vCore licensing model, there all SKUs for vCore licensing are supported. So this is exclusive to the DTU licensing model. Size does matter here. So take a look at that when you are looking at your source environments. Double check that before you sell your org on mirroring, saving you some time. Let's see. Santa, looks like we've got a question from Lucas. Nowadays, I have exactly 3 workspaces, Dev, QA, and Prod, with a single capacity, but I have a doubt about data construction using Lakehouse. One's Gen 2, for example, not have support on pipelines. So my question is, should I build a medallion model just in a specific workspace? Using Synapse, I have all governance separated. How can I build this structure without having a hard work 3 times? That's an interesting dilemma. So let's talk about medallion. The medallion model in a specific workspace, I would say typically I'd advocate for that, because to move data from layer to layer, depending on what your medium is for moving data, those solutions are going to have a lot easier time finding and defining connections to the various levels of your medallion architecture if it's in the same workspace. I'll say not necessarily that you can't do it split across workspaces, but the big question you'll have is if you combine that with like a dev QA prod situation. We'll talk data deployment pipelines later on here. There's a big deployments in Fabric are a little bit complicated. And my concern would be is if you have your architecture spread across multiple workspaces, it's going to make your deployments even more complicated. So I would say at least if you're going to build Medallion, do it in just one workspace, and you can at least secure each layer of the Medallion architecture separately if that fits your use case. And hopefully at least that works for any security or any limitations there. And at least how do you build the structure without having to do the hard work 3 times? I'm assuming you're talking the dev to QA to prod. That's where deployment pipelines, I'll say, should help you. I'll talk about that more later. All right, good questions. I like that. Let's keep that going. Shortcutting, mirroring. Those are the common ways that are the easiest ways to get things into the environment. But especially that networking is kind of the consistent issue. What's your way to work around that? There's a preview coming up that helps solve this a little bit more. I'll talk about this more from what the process has been earlier on in Fabric. It's the use of data flows. In data flows, my rating system, unfortunately, this is going to be another BTH. And you might be confused about that because like data flows have been around for some time. It's been a workhorse in Power BI. So let me explain. First of all, the good stuff. Now, at least with the recent announcement at FabCon last week, data flows now support a more effective way to configure incremental processing. This was going to be a big issue when I developed this presentation. Now, there's hope for the future. Other things that are going well, the fact that it navigates networks. For example, mirroring. If I can't get to my Azure SQL DB via public endpoint, now this gives me an option where I can get access to it via its private endpoint. So I can solve for that. Quick to set up. If you're doing like Medallion and you're just copying the data in via Bronze, there's not a whole lot to the basic data flow itself, so very easy to set up. Most times, if I'm copying like a singular table, I can get that over in like 5 minutes to get that set up. And dynamic schema. This was a feature I wasn't aware of initially, so I wanted to call that out here. The fun thing when you define the destination of your data flows is you have an option when you establish a new table to pick dynamic schema. What the idea behind it is, if, for example, your source schema changes and you want to quickly reflect that in your copy in Fabric, dynamic schema essentially means you open up your data flow, you take a look at the settings for your destination, and it automatically detects that there's new columns and changes to columns and knows how to get it to destination without you having to do additional configuration. Works a little bit weird if you are deleting columns, because in cases like that, it might actually delete the column, or it might keep the column, but it'll just be null for all records. That depends a little bit on the settings that you put here. But I wanted to call that out because I thought that was a really cool feature of the data flows. So why do I give it a BTH? Flow ownership frustration in a nutshell. If you've worked with data flows and you're working with multiple developers, the ownership makes it really hard to work with data flows. Because if I take ownership away from somebody else, the connection to my source environment gets essentially removed and I have to reset it up. That is just, it just kind of gives me the creepy crawlies, because one, it means to make these changes is not easy if I have to make adjustments, and I actually had to make a couple for a client earlier this week, and I lost a lot of time because I would have liked to have asked another developer to do it, but I owned all of them, and if I asked them to do it, it would take them longer because of what taking ownership has coming with it. So I'd say, at least for data flows, like for processing enterprise data, if you have to navigate the networks right now, it's almost a necessity. If you don't have to use it, I'd maybe consider some other avenues, unless it's for like a one-off. I've got a particular data set in a source. I just need like one table and that's it. In that case, I think data flows still works well for all of these other reasons that I highlight. But I still give it a BTH because flow ownership. Ugh. Let's see. All right, we've talked enough about that. Let's talk about storage. Storage, lake houses. Good tag. I'm there's not a whole lot to say about lake houses because I think really they work as expected. You can store data in various formats. You can have your SQL endpoint for analysis if people want to write analytical queries to analyze the data. Just make sure people know it's for analysis, not for data manipulation. You can't manipulate data in the lakehouse via the SQL endpoint. The capability to take unmanaged files, CSVs and whatnot, even parquets, and change them to the managed tables, which then shows up in the table section I have here in the screenshot. Good for an initial setup. What I would really like to see, though, for this section here is to take a folder of unmanaged files and create a table from it is still a manual process. If I add another file to that folder in the files section, I then have to reload the table manually through the UI or come up with some automation myself. It'd be really nice if it at least detected that new data existed and would just update. But so far, at least, I haven't been able to get that part to work. Other thing I'll say here too, lakehouses, schemas needs to go generally available. I think this schemas capability, which is currently in preview right now, is going to make lakehouses a lot more flexible and give you different ways of structuring it. But working in it in its preview capacity, there's a lot of gotchas working with it right now. And we've had a really hard time trying to get a successful implementation of that. Then, at least a couple times we've tried, Microsoft has told us, yeah, it's kind of expected because it's a preview feature. It'll all get cleaned up when it needs to, when it goes to GA. So Microsoft, Let's get that to generally available. I'm excited about this feature. That's good for unstructured data. How about structured data? Our ever popular warehouse relational environment. I give this an RFI. I really, 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 really want to give this a tag, but I had to constantly fight with myself over this. And I put this in an RFI, but I say this because I put this at a pretty high standard. A lot of people looking to migrate to Fabric are going to be looking to work with relational data, because that's a lot of times where people are starting their journey. And the warehouse has just that. It's got the things SQL data people crave. Nice idiocracy reference there. But it mostly has what it needs. UI improvement. The UI is a little bit slow at times. It's got mostly what I need. Like, I can get to my tables, my views, my functions, my store procedures, all the things that I typically want to do in an analytical environment. I can do that in a warehouse. But the UI itself makes it hard to work with. So a lot of times I'm actually connecting to it via SSMS, and that's how I'm doing my work. Really bizarre errors at times. If you want a little bit of a giggle, and I haven't double checked if it's still an error or not. I should probably test that. But I made a video a couple months ago where Microsoft Fabric was telling me that I could not insert a null value into a column that allows nulls. You can see that in my address 1 there for null. So it was essentially telling me that I was violating a nullability constraint that didn't exist. Turns out the error actually is just referring to the wrong column. So it's like you can work around it. Just make sure that you always populate your nullability or your columns that require non-null values. Just make sure they're always populated. That was a little bit annoying to have to work through that. So I give it an RFI. And I guess at least the other call out here, if you haven't seen people talk about this, I'd encourage you. Warehouses have a default semantic model associated to it. I typically would not encourage people to use that. There are some nice integrations there, but some of the things that it's impacted is like early on, and I believe they've changed this, but early on when you would implement it, you would get your warehouse, and maybe in the semantic model you'd establish a relationship between two tables that would actually define a constraint then in the database of the warehouse. But when you would like create the table and take a look at some of the constraints and such that would come with it, the constraint wouldn't show up. That's at least been cleaned up, but for at least a number of reasons, I think a lot of times semantic models work better if you create a separate dedicated semantic model and pulling the data from your warehouse that way. For that reason, for deployments, there's a couple reasons why I think it's better to do it that way. All right, let's see. Quick pause for questions. I don't see anything additional there. All right. Pipelines. I'm going to give this a tag. Pipelines, I'll say this is something that people might disagree with me, again, because of design principles. So for me, when I think of pipelines, I'm thinking about the orchestration aspect of pipelines, not necessarily for ingestion of data from source. That might change because now in preview, data pipelines support navigating gateways for things like on-prem environments. I think is possible, but especially for the Azure SQL DB situation I mentioned earlier, that's also covered. So I think that is a really good feature for them to add. And beyond that, it works like an orchestration solution. Easy to orchestrate various facets of Fabric. And honestly, the thing that I really geeked out was the integration with M365 to be able to send emails and Teams messages as part of your pipeline. I have been waiting for this type of feature for Azure Data Factory for years, and it came to us in Fabric, which I think is just a little bit interesting. But that's been a really nice feature, because especially getting an environment started and wanting to know when our solution succeeds, when it fails, nice easy way to just get that basic email out, tell me that there is or is not an error, and if there's an error, I can go in and quickly investigate. Pretty good tag there. Another area, talking a little bit more data processing, is notebooks. Again, here I'm not going to say there's a whole lot to talk about. I think it's a pretty good tag because it's going to make coders happy. You like working with Jupyter notebooks, you're going to like working with notebooks in Fabric, because it makes it easier to get to things like lake houses via the UI and not necessarily have to script out that part and make sure that you've got your appropriate reference to the right table and that you're navigating structures and whatnot. The UI helps you with that. The UI also helps you with making cluster structures, or at least starting up an Apache Spark cluster, really easy to do. So it just makes the life of a developer a little bit easier. Things I'd like to see improved: better documentation on accessing environment info. I expect more of this is coming, because if you've tried using MS Spark utils, I'm under the impression that now there's going to be a notebook utils, a new library coming out, and I'm expecting that will have some better capabilities of navigating the environment if you don't want to interact with like just a singular lake house. But again, I'd say that's a pretty big nitpick. And again, the warehouse integration, I just call that out because right now in the UI, all you can do is in the UI, you can connect to lake houses. You can not connect to warehouses. My understanding is that's at least coming. It's in the pipeline. I forget if that was announced last week. If it wasn't, I'm guessing that's coming somewhere within the foreseeable future. Monitoring. So somebody asked the question about throttling. David asked the question about throttling. Monitoring in Fabric, I give that an RFI. The one thing that I think monitoring does really well is you have one place to do all of your monitoring for everything across workspaces and whatever people are doing within your Fabric capacities. So in that respect, good, nice, simple UI. I can quickly see what of my processes are succeeding, what are not, or what solutions are failing. Why I give this an RFI is because there's some things that we still can't see even with the monitoring capabilities. So somebody asking about how do I, figure out what's the right size for my SKU, knowing the possibility of throttling, bursting, and generating an overage that, in case you're not familiar with it, Fabric allows you to get access to additional resources, but you essentially generate an overage where if that overage hits a certain level, you actually get to the point where nobody can do anything in the Fabric UI because you have too much of an overage, and it stays that way until your overage burns off. That's further complicated by what Microsoft gives us to monitor that capacity, which is the Fabric Capacity Metrics app. If you haven't taken a look at this and you're implementing Fabric, download and install this app in your capacity. Really easy setup. You just need to know your capacity ID and it figures out the rest. So this at least starts to give you some visibility into your environment where you might be generating overages. You can see that in the upper right graphic for capacity units percentage over time. Anything above that line, you're starting to hit an overage. And then you get different views of that on throttling and on overages. But there's one key area where I think right now is kind of a pain point. I'm really hoping that this gets adjusted in the future. Maybe a little hard to see in the graphic, but what I have highlighted here, that's a warehouse. The entire activities of the warehouse is a single line item here. So I can see how much capacity units my warehouse is taking up, but I can't see what exactly within my warehouse implementation is taking up that space. Is it a store procedure that somebody wrote, a really long ad hoc query? I don't know, because it's all in one spot. I would love to see this broken out where I can see individual view store procedures, at least have the option to drill down into that, because this really doesn't tell me much other than the warehouse is taking up a lot of my CUs, and I'm expecting that because my architecture uses it heavily. One additional thing that I will suggest here, and this is a advice for concerns about throttling, because this just tells you that you're at risk of throttling. So, analyze your trends to figure out what your SKU size is. When you hit that overage and you get to the point that even the UI is locked up, here's one trick I've learned. The overage is on the capacity, not on the workspace. So one thing you can do is, if you hit an overage on something like your prod workspace, have a secondary capacity that you can then assign to your production workspace. And then, at least as far as the symptoms goes, the overage symptoms will disappear because you're on a new capacity. Your other capacity still will have its overage and it'll burn it off. But actually, it'll be able to burn it off faster because it doesn't have any new activities going on and it's no longer provisioned to a workspace. So I would at least, that's why I advocate for having multiple capacities, because in a pinch, that saves you if your production environment goes down. If you have a single capacity for everything and prod goes down, you got to just sit there and wait for it to burn itself down. Not exactly the most exciting thing to do. Let's see. All right, let's come up for and see if we've got questions. David Mills asks, to your previous question, it was a Fabric pipeline to a Postgres database that got me. Yeah. For me, I'd say most often when I've hit it, it's processing a large amount of data externally to internally. So if you're having to do full loads from a source environment, yeah, that's going to take up a lot of time. I ended up creating a single data flow for a single table. I didn't check the fact that it had like 7 million records on it, and I was running an F2 SKU, and that caused an overage that the entire environment hit its maximum overage. And then I got a lot of emails on that. So yeah, David, I sympathize with that. I've had a very similar experience to you. Let's see. We've talked monitoring. We've talked a bunch of data processing things. Oh, we haven't talked about, some people brought up dev, QA, production, deployments, or at least like code lifecycle management. Where I rank that is kind of a BTH right now. I really hate to say this, but genuinely, I think this is true. I think that like lifecycle management of solutions or of objects in Fabric, really complicated to do today. Some of the things that I want to make sure people know of that Microsoft is advocating for people to do, and I described this a little bit earlier. If you're wanting to have an effective lifecycle management of objects that you're building, and especially if you're working with multiple developers, the recommended approach they're going to ask you to do is have essentially development workspaces, one for each developer. They'll have a branch in your Git repository that is tethered to the workspace, because right now that's at least the Git integration is you take a branch in a Git repository, you assign that branch to the workspace, and then they check in code into that branch, and then in Git you merge that into your main branch of the repository. That gets you at least into more of these centralized workspaces, where in this example they have 3 stages: a dev to see how everybody's code changes work together in one place, test maybe for some UAT, and then finally for production. Pretty sophisticated way in some respects. But at least most times it seems like the Git integration is really the devs to the shared development area. The rest of it, you're using the deployment pipelines, which is a UI that Microsoft has in Fabric that lets you essentially do a quick code differential and do a deployment. The UI is good. The recent update to the UI, even better. It looks nice and pretty. It's still a BTH for one fundamental reason. Objects deploy as singular objects. And especially when you have something like a warehouse, which right now is considered a singular object, the deployment pipelines only give me the option to deploy the warehouse in its entirety. So imagine if I've got like 6 developers working in my warehouse and they've got 6 different changes sitting in my development environment, looking pretty good. I promote it to test. And then I find 1 or 2 of the code changes did not pass UAT, but I want to deploy the remaining 4. Then I essentially have to wipe out those 2 in the dev environment, readjust my branch, redeploy to dev, get those 4 out to test, wipe out the rest of it, and then finally do my deployment to production. That's a whole lot of extra work when what would make it easier is me being able to pick and choose, for example, in a warehouse, what are the particular code changes I want to deploy. Because we think about databases and warehouses are included as objects. It's a library of objects of tables, views, and stored procedures. If I could pick those individual items and deploy it, I'd use the deployment pipelines more regularly. But I'll say right now, I rarely use the deployment pipelines because most times I have some changes that are ready to go, some changes that are not, and that pretty much makes it where I can't use this UI. Been asking Microsoft, and I have to double check if there are any ideas out on Fabric ideas for this yet, but if not, I'll be adding that soon to see if we can get some more granular capabilities for deployment pipelines. So pretty strong BTH. I really want this to work because I think if they can get this functional in a couple of different situations, this will be great. I really am looking forward to the solution. Right now, it's got a ways to go, if you ask me. Last thing to talk about here is let's talk community. Again, this isn't about feature of Fabric, but it's really something that I think is going to be crucial for the promotion of Fabric and how it changes over the coming years. Community, I give it a tag so far. I think the community is rallying around this product, and it's clear even from this basic graphic. If you look at Microsoft Fabric ideas, pretty much any way you slice and dice the ideas that are out there, there's thousands of ideas out there, which means people like it and they want to see it improved. If you ask me, this was one of the core fundamental things that made Power BI the awesome solution that it is today. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. If we can replicate that same community involvement with something as big as Fabric, this product is going to be fantastic in the coming years. You can see it from community events, such as earlier in September, there was a Microsoft Fabric Global Online Conference, a brand new conference that showed up just for this product within its first year. That's a whole lot of effort around a product that just came around. So some people really see a lot of value here. Also say it because I have to say it here. The Fabric Cafe that we're in here. You've got YouTube channels. You've got the Fabric Ideas page and its involvement. You've got content creators like me and others in the community that are rallying around this to help share knowledge. But like this presentation here, also be honest about what is working well, what isn't working well, and where do we go to get the things that aren't working well to be tags, to be fantastic. So I'm beyond thrilled to see all of the engagement that's been happening in the community. I've been happy to get out there and get engaged myself in situations like this. And I don't see this as a train that's stopping at any point. We're going to keep riding the train until, we'll see. Stars the limit. AI's the limit. I don't know. I feel like I have to insert AI into these presentations at some point because everybody's talking about AI. So for me, that's year one in a nutshell. Some things working really well. Some things, a little bit of room for improvement. Some things, bad things are happening right now. And I think that genuinely needs some strong fixes going ahead. But again, this isn't a let's overly rag on the product. To be perfectly honest, like I said earlier, I've been working in the data industry for over a decade. And I'll say genuinely, this past year working on Fabric has been the most fun I've had working in the data industry in years, easily. The product is fun, even sometimes navigating around these nuances, also fun. And that's just a great feeling to get back into that space. So hopefully it's clear here that some areas need to improve, but this is a really good product. If you're looking to get started with your analytical journey and you don't have anything yet, great place to start with an F2 SKU. You know, the price point is pretty reasonable. If you're already on your journey and you want to expand out into real-time intelligence or building out some foundational things with ML models or using a data activator, setting up data alerts. There's so many good things that I didn't even talk about in today's presentation that is out there waiting for you to use it at, for the most part, a flat cost. So I think this product has had a great first year, and that makes me more excited to see what year two holds. If I think about what I want to see on year two for my personal wish list, warehouse. Warehouse needs to be continually grown. The UI needs to get better. There's a couple of things that it doesn't have yet as far as supporting certain T-SQL functions that I'd like to see out there. Hopefully, at least we'll get some expansion out there. I think so. I think last week they announced some T-SQL updates. I assume more will come in the future. Deployments needs a lot of work. I think at least we need a lot of improvement there to better support that life cycle, because we should use a solution like this in a very sophisticated way. And right now, the sophisticated way is kind of hard. And we all want that, you know, nice sophisticated shirt and tie solution, right? So I think deployments needs an improvement. Mirroring with networking. I've been waiting for this solution. Like, I was strongly advocating for this even when I went to FabCon back in March. Still really didn't see any updates from FabCon last week. That, I think, if they can get through the networking capabilities of mirroring beyond just opening up the types of sources you can mirror to, that is going to be a big game changer for helping people get up and running quickly. And then finally, super nitpick here, dark theme in the online UI. Come on, we finally got Power BI Desktop, a dark theme, but we couldn't do it in the UI. And if you've seen other videos I've made, even SSMS doesn't have its own native dark theme unless you use SQL shades, and I don't count the one that's hidden behind the scenes. A dark theme in the online UI, is that asking so much? Please. Okay, maybe I'm exaggerating a bit. And that brings it to kind of the end. I think, again, I've been really happy with the product. I'm looking forward to year two. And, you know, this is just, I'm hoping to do this more year 2, year 3, year 4. Let's keep seeing this product going. And part of that is communities like this getting out there. Let's hold Fabric to a standard. Let's get some new ideas out there. Let's get Microsoft working on it. Ooh, Shamim has a comment on the dark theme in Power BI is a bit too dark, I feel. Dark gray, perhaps? Yeah, I kind of had that same vibe too. And I've worked some pretty dark themes in the past, and could maybe use a little bit of tweaking. But hey, it's at least better to have one than to have none at all. And to be fair, I'd say at least that dark theme is a whole lot better than the SSMS native dark theme. In case anybody hasn't seen it, there's a reason why SQL Shades was created. I'll say it that way. All right, that kind of wraps it up. So let's wrap it up and talk riddles. So, Sunny, can you walk me through this a little bit? How?
Hey, thank you so much. Thank you for your energy first and for all the information you shared with us. So now let's move on to an interesting part, which is riddle. So I'm just gonna give a quick reminder to all the attendees about the StreamYard. For participating in the riddle section, you just have to uh, put the answer on a StreamYard, nowhere else, like LinkedIn or YouTube. Just make sure to switch to uh, uh, StreamYard for answering the riddle. Okay, let's go. Let's go. Who's
All
gonna
right.
be our lucky winners today?
All right. So I got 2 riddles for you today, and it's
Perfect.
at least stuff that we talked about a little bit in today's session. So first riddle is, what was the weird error Jared found in manipulating data in the warehouse? We talked about this a little bit. There was a YouTube video on this. So if you take a look at my YouTube channel, no cheating, no cheating. There was something that I was trying to do within the warehouse. Yeah, I think Jeffrey's got that first one. Yep, nullable. I was trying to insert a null value into a column that accepted nulls, and it wouldn't let me do it.
Yeah.
So, yep, right there. Failed to insert null into a nullable column. Jeez. Kind of a weird error message. All right. So there we got that. All right, second one. Second one is, what is the maximum storage size for semantic models in an F2 SKU? Yep, Adrian gets it right off the bat. 3 gigabytes. 3 gigabytes is your limitation today. So the UI to see it is not 100% clear, but that's a limitation based on documentation. Excellent.
Excellent. Thank you.
So at least then, I guess kind of wrapping that up for me. Again, thanks to the Microsoft Fabric Cafe for having me on here. Honor and a pleasure to talk with this group today, and hopefully a little bit of fun here, but hopefully you learned a thing or two about the product and some tidbits to use. If you like this particular approach, and I covered my own QR code. Oh, geez. If you like this type of storytelling and you want to hear more stories that I tell in the data space, check out my YouTube channel called Data Bard. I post content out similar to the topics we're talking about today. A couple videos on Fabric so far and working with other Azure SQL products. More to come there as people have questions. Otherwise, best hold of me would be my LinkedIn channel or my LinkedIn profile. Feel free to connect out with me. Happy to engage in the community out there. Twitter, I posted out there, but I'm pretty sure I check my Twitter like once every century. So I don't get out there a whole lot. But feel free to follow me. I'm trying to get better about posting my updates there. And honestly, if you have any other questions, thoughts that you want to share via email, databardis@gmail.com is my my email address here. But yeah, feel free to reach out there. Check out my YouTube content for more education. And if you have any other questions I didn't answer today, please let me know. I'm looking to answer more questions in this space as we go along and continue to educate. That's about all I got.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate that. So somebody's looking for your T-shirt, Lucas. Where can I find this T-shirt?
Go to one of the FabCon conferences. That's where I got this one actually.
Okay, nice, nice. Thank you so much again, Jared, for all the information and for today's actually presentation. So there's just a few slides that I'm gonna share right now to wrap up the session quickly. So as you guys know, we have AI skill challenge this period of time. So if you guys join late or you missed today's session and the previous session, so it's going to be available on our social platform. You can just go there and find them and rewatch those. And we have like 4 upcoming sessions, which is related to AI skill challenges. All the registration link are already announced on our social platform, like Indeed. Indeed, you can just go there, LinkedIn, and you can just go there and register right away. And thank you guys again for attending today's session, which was really good. And just stay tuned for the upcoming session. And as you can see, we have our social platform, YouTube. Just make sure subscribe us over there, and LinkedIn. Connect with us and join our Microsoft Learning Room. If you guys get any certification, just share with us, with me, Jared, and that's it. Jared, if there's anything that you want to share, please go ahead.
Uh, last last thing I'll call out is Shamim just made the comment about, oh yeah, it looks so different in a suit. So funny story I'll share on that. So that picture, if you're not familiar with Rimini and you want something goofy to work around with, download the app on your phone. It's a whole lot of fun. So the story behind that picture is Rimini works where you essentially upload like 12 to 13 selfies of yourself, and then they've got some pre-trained models of image generation that then essentially tries to insert your face with the styling and whatnot in the picture. So I had a really interesting idea, which was like most times, selfies and such, they're expecting you to have all these nice smiling faces and, looking normal, which I don't most of the time. So I did this test to say, what if I upload 12 photos of me having ridiculous facial expressions, smiles, and just like moving my face all over the place? That's what it came up with. It's essentially trying to match up multiple weird facial expressions, and came up with some interesting things. So glad you appreciated it. That was a fun experiment.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jared, and thank you guys again for today's session. So until the next Saturday and another 8 a.m. Pacific time. So have a good weekend. Thank you.
Take care, everybody. I'll see you next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.